The pickers at Verona Orchards laughed out loud when Lena Vasquez first backed her truck up to the cull pile. To them, those bruised, half-fermented apples were worthless, a cost to be buried. But Lena, a former logistics analyst, recognized concentrated sugar, wild yeast, and the raw material for a wild fermented apple brandy no one else could replicate. Within 18 months, tasting rooms from Brooklyn to Portland were bidding for every bottle. The orchard's disposal budget had been the cheapest asset they ever threw away. 18 months earlier, Lena Vasquez was a logistics analyst who just poured her entire savings into a derelict cider mill. Her family thought she'd lost her mind. The orchard managers dismissed her as naive. But standing in that cold, empty building, she held a conviction nobody else in the county shared: that the fruit everyone threw away was the key to something extraordinary. She spent 10 years optimizing supply chains for companies that moved millions of units a year. Pallets, inventory turns, waste ratios. That was her language. When the old Carter cider mill went up for auction, everyone saw a gutted building with a rusted press and a leaking roof. Lena saw a fermentation facility with existing infrastructure, zoning that permitted alcohol production, and a 5-figure price tag that let her buy it outright. She handed over a cashier's check and slept on a cot in the boiler room while the ink dried. Across the county, Haverson Orchards was bleeding money on disposal. Every autumn, a third of their harvest, hundreds of thousands of pounds, ended up as culls. Bruised drops, hail-scarred fruit, apples that went soft at the shoulder. Tipping fees, diesel, and labor cost them over $40,000 a year just to make the waste disappear. When Lena walked into the operations office and asked for all of it, the manager laughed into his coffee. He told her the fruit was already rotting, full of wasps, and smelled like a brewery dumpster. She told him that was exactly the point. Here, what the orchard didn't understand: an apple that started to rot has already begun converting its starches to sugar. The concentration is higher than anything you'd get from a perfect grocery store Honeycrisp. And the wild yeast clinging to those cracked skins. That's the same biological engine that distillers in Normandy and Alsace have relied on for centuries to make eau de vie. Traditional distilleries trim their fruit to perfection and then have to add commercial yeast and sugar to hit the numbers they need. Lena was being handed the raw materials already fully armed, but knowing the theory and surviving the practice are two different animals. Her first batch went into the repurposed dairy tank in late September. 400 pounds of Haverson's ugliest apples, crushed and left to ferment wild. For 3 days, the air in the mill turned sweet and boozy, and she started to believe she might actually pull this off. On day 4, she opened the tank and found a gray, bubbling mat of mold so thick she could peel it off in sheets. She failed to sanitize the tank properly, and bacteria had beaten the yeast to the sugar. Batch 2, she sterilized everything. The fermentation started clean, bubbled for a week, and produced a hard cider that actually tasted intentional. She was ecstatic. Then she ran it through her small copper still and cut into the heart of the spirit. The first sip hit her tongue like acetone and regret. Off flavors, fusel alcohols, a burn that didn't belong anywhere near a finished brandy. She pulled too wide a cut, collecting compounds that a skilled distiller discards. She dumped the entire run down the floor drain. By batch 5, she'd learned to isolate yeast strains from the orchard's own apple skins, developing a living culture she could use repeatedly for consistency. She built a small lab bench with pH meters, hydrometers, and a temperature-controlled fermentation cabinet. But she was burning through months and savings faster than she'd planned. The neighbors in the little town of Millbrook had started to talk. The woman at the cider mill, they said, was brewing something strange in there. A few of the orchard workers drove by on their evenings, slowing down to see if the lights were still on. Then came the night that nearly ended everything. Barrel number 7 had been aging for 2 months, resting in a charred oak cask she'd bought used from a Kentucky distillery. She tasted the spirit a week earlier and noted it was finally starting to round out, the sharp edges softening into something floral and honeyed. She went into the mill at midnight to check the humidity levels, and as she stepped through the door, her boot splashed into something wet. The entire cask had split at the staves, dumping nearly 40 gallons of 6-month-aged brandy across the concrete floor. She stood in the dark, surrounded by the smell of evaporated alcohol and shattered hope, and didn't move for a long time. She almost walked away that night. The phone was in her hand, her brother's number pulled up, and she was ready to admit what everyone had already assumed. But something stopped her. In the corner of the mill where the flood hadn't reached, a single-gallon jar from Batch 4 sat forgotten on a shelf. She walked over, unscrewed the lid, and poured an inch into a tasting glass. The spirit was clean and golden, with a stone fruit finish that lingered on her tongue like a promise she hadn't heard yet. She set the glass down and stared at it. And that's when she realized what she'd been missing all along. The jar she'd pulled from the shelf wasn't from Batch 4. It was a misfit, a single gallon she'd siphoned off early and forgotten because it wasn't dark enough, because it didn't have the caramel and vanilla she thought a proper brandy needed. She'd spent months chasing the amber glow of a Kentucky bourbon, when the answer was crystal clear and the color of pale straw. Real eau de vie doesn't hide its fruit under charred wood. It rides on it. Lena had been aging her spirit into something it was never meant to be, and the barrel failure had forced her to taste what she'd been too stubborn to consider. She scrapped every charred cask in the mill. In their place, she brought in neutral stainless steel tanks and a half-dozen varietal-specific barrels made from French oak that had already been used 3 times, just enough to smooth the edges without stealing the apple. She also started fermenting the apples on their skins for 5 days before pressing, the way red winemakers draw out color and tannin. The wild yeast she'd isolated from the oldest block of Stayman winesap trees at Haverson, a strain she'd tested and retested until it produced a consistent tropical ester she could identify blind, became her house culture. She labeled it Strain H3, stored a mother colony in a refrigerated vial, and never had to gamble on spontaneous wild fermentation again. Batch 8 was the one. She ran the still slow, discarding the methanol-heavy foreshots with surgical precision, pulling the heart at exactly 78 degrees Celsius, and cutting away the tail the moment the earthy wet cardboard notes surfaced. When the spirit dripped off the condenser, she caught it in a tasting glass and didn't move for a full minute. It smelled like a Honeycrisp bitten in an orchard, layered with pear skin, white flowers, and a mineral finish that reminded her of crushed stone. The mouthfeel was silky, the heat gentle. She poured a second glass and sat in the mill office with the door open, letting the autumn air wash over her. Word travels fast in a town where everyone knows your failures before you do. A local chef named Owen Prout caught wind of what Lena was doing and drove out one evening to see for himself. He expected homemade hooch. He got a tasting flight that ended with him reaching for his phone to cancel his current spirit supplier. He bought 6 cases on the spot and asked if she could produce enough for his 3 restaurants by spring. Lena said yes before she knew whether it was true. Within a month, she had orders from 2 more farm-to-table spots in the Hudson Valley, and an inquiry from a specialty bottler in Brooklyn who'd heard about the woman turning orchard waste into something called Millbrook Reserve Eau de Vie. She was suddenly running spreadsheets again, but this time they mapped real revenue, small figures still, but climbing. The same neighbors who'd slowed their trucks to gawk at the mill started leaving jars of honey and handwritten notes on her doorstep. The orchard workers who'd laughed now called her the Brandy Lady, and not with the same edge they used before. Then Grant Ashby, the operations manager at Haverson Orchards, showed up unannounced with a clipboard and a proposition. He wanted a partnership. The cull apples weren't just disposal anymore. They were raw material for a product that was beginning to command $40 a bottle at tastings in Manhattan. He'd done the math, and he wanted a percentage of every case sold. Lena listened, thanked him, and said she'd think about it. What she thought about was the fact that the very thing that made her operation viable, the free, unwanted fruit, could become her biggest liability if the orchard decided to charge her a premium now that they understood its worth. She had no contract, and Grant knew it. The tension brewed quietly through the winter as she filled orders from her single still, working 18-hour days to keep up with demand. She hired a former orchard hand named Marcus to help with fermentation and bottling, but the numbers were tight. A regional distributor reached out wanting 600 bottles a month, enough to put her in specialty shops across the Northeast, but it would require scaling her production fourfold. The equipment alone would cost $60,000, and her savings were already bottomed out. She could take on debt. She could find investors. Or she could walk away from the distributor and risk watching someone else beat her to the market she'd carved out from nothing. And that was when she got the letter from a spirits conglomerate offering to buy her label outright. A lowball number with a non-disclosure agreement tucked into the envelope like a promise and a threat at the same time. They'd been tracking her accounts, her sales trajectory, the buzz around her wild fermented process. They told her the offer was generous for a cottage operation. Lena folded the letter and set it on her desk next to the spreadsheet she couldn't balance. The easy choice was to sell and walk away with enough money to never look at an apple again. The other choice was to fight for something she'd built from a pile of rotting fruit and a single salvaged jar of spirit that had told her the truth when she was ready to hear it. Lena didn't sleep that night. She sat in the mill office with the acquisition letter flattened under a half-empty coffee mug and ran the numbers again. The offer was low, but it was real, a way out with more money than she'd made in her last 5 years combined. She could pay off the mill, help her family, and never spend another winter morning thawing frozen hoses. Every logical instinct told her to take it, but logic wasn't what built this place. She folded the letter back into its envelope, wrote a one-sentence rejection on a post-it note, and stuck it to the fridge. The next morning, Grant Ashby parked his truck by the loading dock and walked inside without knocking. He'd heard about the acquisition offer. Word travels faster in a small town than a grass fire, and he wanted to know what her answer meant for Haverson Orchards. The free apple arrangement had always been informal, a handshake deal between a young woman with empty land and an orchard that wanted to dodge disposal costs. Grant reminded her without raising his voice that she had no contract, no purchase agreement, and no legal claim to a single apple from his trees. If demand for her brandy was going up, he said, the apples were no longer waste. They were inventory, and inventory has a price. Lena had anticipated this. She'd spent 3 weeks quietly building relationships with 4 smaller orchards within a 40-mile radius, places that grew older varieties on marginal land, the kind of orchards that didn't have the volume for giant contracts but had exactly the fruit she wanted. She'd already negotiated pricing, secured a provisional supply agreement, and lined up a refrigerated trailer to haul fruit from multiple sites. She told Grant she appreciated everything the orchard had done, but if he wanted to treat the apples as commodities, she'd buy them elsewhere. She slid a folder across the table with the new supplier contracts, fully signed. Grant stared at the signatures for a long moment and left without another word. The confrontation was a victory, but it exposed a deeper vulnerability. The new supply agreements cost her nearly $12,000 a year in fruit alone, a line item she'd never budgeted for when her raw material was free. Combined with the scaling demands from the regional distributor, her financial runway shrank to maybe 6 months. Every bank she approached saw a niche product with no collateral and a founder who'd never run a business. The spirits conglomerate, sensing blood in the water, made a second offer, this one even lower, with a note that implied the number would keep dropping the longer she waited. Then the break came from a direction nobody expected. Owen Prout, the chef who'd been her first buyer, mentioned her brandy in a profile piece for a national food magazine. The article called Millbrook Reserve the most interesting eau de vie coming out of the Northeast, and devoted a full sidebar to the story of the orchard culls and the shattered barrel. Within a week, an investor named Carla Henshaw, a former beverage executive who'd started and sold 2 craft distilleries, reached out through the magazine's editor. She wasn't offering an acquisition. She was offering a partnership. Carla flew in from Seattle, spent 2 days tasting every batch in the barrel room, and sat down across from Lena with a term sheet that gave her a 40% stake in exchange for $150,000 in growth capital. No control clause, no rebranding mandate, no demand to scale beyond what the fruit could support. She looked at Lena's notebook of fermentation logs, her yeast library, and the story she'd built from a single salvage jar, and said something that made Lena's hands go still on the table. You're not selling a brandy. You're selling the proof that the industry has been throwing away its best raw material for decades. The capital let her move fast. She bought 2 larger stills from a closing distillery in Vermont, retrofitted the mill's second floor for additional fermentation tanks, and hired a dedicated salesperson to manage the accounts that had been piling up. The regional distributor's 600-bottle order was fulfilled within 60 days. By the end of the first quarter under the new partnership, Millbrook Reserve was on shelves in 11 states and had cracked a restaurant group in Napa that typically only carried European imports. And that was when the conglomerate changed tactics. Instead of trying to buy her, they started building a competing product. They contracted with a large juice apple farm in Washington, added commercial yeast and beet sugar, and launched a Cull apple brandy under an existing spirits label with a 6-figure marketing push behind it. The press release mentioned sustainability, upcycling, and giving overlooked fruit a second chance. Phrases Lena had used in her own small batch brand story for years. The product undercut her on price and flooded the market just as she was trying to expand into new territory. Carla called it what it was, a head-on attempt to make her irrelevant by borrowing her narrative and cheapening the things she'd actually done. The conglomerate didn't have the biology. They weren't using wild yeast, they weren't fermenting on skins, and their apples had never even been within 50 miles of an old-growth orchard. But they had shelf space, and they had the budget to drown her signal in noise. Lena's response was the only move she had left. She went in the opposite direction. Instead of competing on price, she raised hers. She launched a limited orchard series single varietal brandy, each release tied to a specific apple variety from a single farm. She hosted tastings in the mill, where customers could walk the rows of the old trees that had inspired her yeast culture. She put the faces of the growers on the labels. The more the conglomerate tried to commodify the story, the more she made it personal, specific, and impossible to counterfeit. By the 3rd month of the price war, something shifted. The accounts that had taken the competitors' cheaper brandy started coming back. Bartenders reported that the mass-market version lacked the complexity and fruit-forward character of Millbrook Reserve, a gap that couldn't be hidden by a marketing budget. The story mattered, but the liquid mattered more. And her liquid was still the one that had been fermented from true wild yeast, on apples the industry had already written off. The moment the tide turned for good happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. A refrigerated truck pulled into the mill yard, but it wasn't one of the small orchards she'd been working with. It was a Haverson truck, double-parked behind the loading dock. Grant Ashby climbed down from the cab with an envelope in his hand. He'd seen the numbers. The orchard's disposal costs had crept back up after she stopped taking their fruit, and her new suppliers were getting their names on labels that were being poured in restaurants he read about online. He wanted back in, but this time on her terms. The envelope contained a long-term supply agreement with a guaranteed volume, no charge for 3 years, and a first right of refusal clause that gave her priority access to specific heritage blocks. He'd signed it already. All that was left was her signature, and a choice about what kind of partner she wanted to be. 18 months after she sat alone in the mill with a letter telling her to sell and walk away, Lena Vasquez pulled up to Verona Orchards in a paid-off delivery van, ready to pick up fruit that had once been laughed at as worthless. The same orchard workers who had mocked her were now loading the truck themselves. That van, those apples, and everything she'd built from them were about to become the foundation of a 6-figure empire. And the best chapter hadn't even started yet. The signed agreement with Grant Ashby wasn't just a supply contract. It was the final piece of a machine that had been building for 2 years. He'd come back on her terms, no charge, priority access, a handshake that carried more weight than any legal filing. When the Haverson trucks resumed their Tuesday route to the mill, the same crews who once laughed from the flatbed were now stacking fruit with care, sorting by variety because the brandy demanded it. The orchard's disposal line item, once a $40,000 annual wound, dropped to zero and then reversed into a profit share. Haverson's heritage blocks, neglected for decades, suddenly had a buyer who paid for the story and the skins. Millbrook Reserve crossed into six-figure revenue 14 months after Carla Henshaw wrote her check. By the end of the second year, the tasting room in the old cider barn was pulling visitors from as far as California. Bartenders in Brooklyn argued about which single varietal release deserved a permanent back bar spot. A restaurant group in Portland placed a standing order that paid the salaries of 3 full-time workers at the mill. The conglomerate's competitor brand, stripped of the wild yeast and skin contact fermentation that made hers authentic, quietly disappeared from shelves within 8 months. You can copy a label, but you can't copy the biology of a 10-acre orchard block that's been fermenting its own wild culture for 80 years. The pickers who mocked her now brought their families to weekend tastings. Lena poured for them herself, not because she wanted gratitude, but because she remembered what it felt like to be dismissed for asking the wrong question. The neighbor who joked about calling the county extension office now sold her honey at the mill's seasonal market. The feed storewoman who'd been kind during the roughest months had a permanent case of Millbrook Reserve shipped to her doorstep at Christmas, free of charge. Lena didn't need apologies. The shelf space said everything. In the back of the mill, behind the fermentation tanks and the copper still that still bore the scratch from the night the barrel split, sat a wooden crate that had been sealed since before she bought the property. Her grandfather, Arthur Vasquez, had worked the same building as a cider mill operator until the late 70s, when falling apple prices and rising debt forced him to shutter the doors. She never opened the crate, assuming it held old tax records and rusted parts. One evening, with a distributor meeting finished and the still cooling down, she pried off the lid with a crowbar and found what Arthur had left behind. Inside were fermentation logs written in a tight, careful script that matched the writing on the faded sign above the press. He'd attempted wild apple brandy in 1972, using the same cull fruit from a neighboring orchard that she now sourced from Haverson. The logs tracked sugar levels, ambient temperatures, and pH readings, nearly identical to the system she'd built independently half a century later. His batch numbers stopped at 7. A final entry dated October 11th read simply, "Barrel split, lost it all. Some fruit is just not meant for anything but the ground." Lena sat on the cold concrete floor and held the page under a bare bulb. Her grandfather had walked away from the exact disaster that nearly broke her, with no salvage jar on a forgotten shelf to pull him back. She finished what he started, not because she was smarter or tougher, but because she'd had one thing he didn't: a single gallon of spirit that survived a mistake long enough to prove the truth. The fruit had always been good enough. He just needed one more morning to see it. She set the ledger on the shelf above her tasting glasses, next to the vial labeled H3, and walked out to meet the Tuesday truck. The morning air smelled like ripe apples and wet stone. The driver, a kid barely out of high school who'd heard the stories about the brandy lady, asked if she ever got tired of the smell. She told him it was the smell of money. The apples never knew they were supposed to be worthless. By the time Lena Vasquez finished proving that point, neither did anyone else. That ledger entry, the one written by a man who walked away because a barrel split, sits in a glass case in the tasting room now. People read it while they sip his granddaughter's brandy, and the older ones understand something the younger ones are still learning. The line between what you throw away and what makes you rich is thinner than anyone wants to admit. A barrel split cost Arthur Vasquez his dream. The exact same disaster gave Lena hers, because she had one jar she forgot to throw out and enough stubbornness to taste it. The orchards are still dumping fruit somewhere tonight. Not just here. Every agricultural region in the world buries or burns a percentage of what it grows because the market says it's not good enough. But the market doesn't ferment. It doesn't taste. It just assigns numbers, and numbers miss a lot. Lena built a six-figure empire because she refused to let a spreadsheet tell her what was valuable. She tasted what everyone else had already written off. If this story reminded you that your own overlooked chances might be sitting in plain sight, hit subscribe before the next one disappears. Tell us in the comments about something you almost missed: a job, a person, a project that started messy and turned into something real. Share this with someone who's standing in the wreckage of a barrel that split and needs to know they might be one jar away from the truth. And let us know where in the world you're watching from tonight. This one earns it.